Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman. You can visit Unleashed at umbrex.com/unleashed. Sign up for the weekly email, view the transcripts of this and all previous episodes. I'm excited to be here today with Oscar Trimboli, who is joining me from Australia. It's 6 a.m. his time, so that's amazing. Oscar is the author of How to Listen, and he is also the host of a podcast, Deep Listening. I'm so thrilled. We're going to talk about listening, obviously. Oscar, welcome to the show.
G'day, Will. Looking forward to listening to your questions.
All right. So what I thought we could do to really make this specific is to get into listening in the context of an initial discussion with a client when you've about a particular project, right? So when you're in the door, maybe you've exchanged emails, maybe you've been referred or introduced. So the client, it's not an initial pitch where you're just talking about your firm, but there is some project on the table. David A. Fields calls this a context discussion. And I wanted to talk with you about the context of listening in that scenario. So first, let me get your initial reactions to that topic for today.
One of the first things you want to be conscious of is that for that context call, listening happens before, during, and after the conversation. A lot of people get obsessed with that moment when you're in contact and face-to-face with the client. You're missing a number of listening opportunities if all you're doing is turning up in that moment and having a conversation. So when we initially booked this interview, for example, the first question I asked you, Will, was, who's in your audience? And your reply to me was, oh, wow, you're already listening. The point is listening happens before you get into that dialogue. So think about how you can make that a ramp into the face-to-face or the virtual video conversation rather than only a conversation. So often a simple set of questions, I'll give you 3 that you can pose before you get into the room, will change the way the speaker communicates their idea, the prospective client. So a question you might simply ask them is, what will make this a good conversation? Be careful, don't say what would make this a good conversation for you, because one of the things we want to be conscious of as the leader in the room, you need to be making sure you're progressing the dialogue, not just what the client is saying. And we'll get a bit into that later on. So question number 1, what will make this a great meeting for you? Question number 2, how have projects like this played out before? And question number 3 will be, how long have you been working on this project, as an example? Now, this is helping them know that before you get in the room, you have the 3 characteristics of great listeners. So we've researched over 26,000 workplace listeners, and what they have in common is curiosity, flexibility, and openness, and that's that curiosity there. So even before you get in the room for the context conversation, you can be listening. So I'm curious, before we get in the room, what's going through your mind as you hear that?
I love these questions. I particularly, and I want to clarify, I'll do my little listening, my question for you. So would you, so let's say it's some project, a strategy project. We need some help on strategy for this chain of dental clinics. I don't know. So someone's reached out to you and referred you, perhaps. It's like, hey, Jane, please meet my friend Will. He can help you on this strategy project. We've been introduced, and Jane says, great. So normally what I would do in that, and I want to really double click on this and get it very fine. I get an introduction. I would normally just reply and say something like, Oscar, thanks so much for the introduction. Shifting you to BCC to save your inbox. Then I'd say, Jane, we could certainly help with this project. We like to start with a short context discussion to make sure we understand, the background and what sort of consultant you're looking for. Would you be open to a short discussion please let me know a time that works for you, or if easier, you can pick time in my Calendly. So that's what I normally do. So you're asking a couple additional questions. Would you put those in that email? Are you expecting the person to reply, or are you saying, hey, these are things that I'd like to cover in that session?
I'm loving that we're getting into the specificity of it. So few conversations I have with podcast hosts that get into this level of detail, and this is where the gold is. So one of the things, if you are the expert in the field of adjusting the way a dental practice goes to market, you should know the 3 common issues that they're going to be dealing with. So I would just add on to that email that you sent, hey, Jane, when we work with clients like yours, typical problems are 1, 2, and 3, and yours could be completely different. I'm curious which one of those it might be. Now, whether they answer or respond doesn't matter. What you're already doing is trying to position yourself completely different from anybody else. What you're signaling to them is, 1, you've worked with other people in their industry, and if you haven't, maybe you've worked with other medical professionals and you know this problem. So every email is an opportunity to collect some additional piece of insight. Don't miss that opportunity. If you're not sending an email with a question, you're probably missing an opportunity there. So sometimes we go, oh, look, I don't even know them. Why would I be asking these preemptive questions? Isn't that a bit arrogant? Isn't that a bit of an assumption? Well, the reason we want to ask these questions as early as possible is this. We want to solve the client's problem, but not in all cases can we solve it. You may want to figure out really quickly that the kind of problem they want to solve, you need to refer to somebody else altogether. Be a problem solver, not just somebody who's trying to make a transaction for that client. How would that question and those 3 bullet points sit in an email you might send out, Will?
So I would have a slightly different approach. And it might be just because of the type of firm that I run, which is my own business, Umbrex, is helping clients find the right independent consultant for a project rather than being that actual expert myself who's going to be the one doing it. So I would probably, personally, I would typically not do something like that of saying, hey, in situations like this, here's 3 things we typically see, or not so much because I feel it would be presumptuous, but more my psychology thinking here is that I want to make it as frictionless as possible to get to the next stage that I want, which is I want to have that call. I want to have that meeting with the person. And I want to remove any possible barriers and making it easy as frictionless as possible for them to say, yes, yeah, let's hop on a call on, Thursday at 4 p.m., right? And just get to that stage and not make them think, oh, geez, he's giving me these 3 things. Because if I've been referred and the person's already said, yeah, I'd like to meet with you, then I've passed the bar of getting to that meeting and we just have to schedule it. Whereas if it was someone who's more thinking about, is this person the right fit or not, they're not yet committed to the meeting, then I'd have to try to express a bit more credibility, right? I'm kind of past the point of proving credibility if I'm already about to get the meeting. So that's kind of the difference.
Yeah. And do you think your approach about being frictionless is about you or them?
Well, I think it's about, good question. I'd say it's about them because I'm thinking it from their perspective. They already are, if they're already willing to meet with me, then I'm trying to be respectful of their time and not make additional barriers. I want to make it as easy as possible for them to say, sure, let's meet. And I generally find that it's easier for people to give me a 7-minute download on a Zoom versus taking 7 minutes to write an email and put their thoughts together. It's usually easier for people just to talk it through than to try to put it all in an email. So.
And would you speculate there may be a subset of clients who would be comfortable replying to an email?
Some would. I think that I have thought about adopting my email a little bit, which is, I haven't done this, but it just occurred to me over the past few days, of changing my normal response, which is more like giving people an expectation of what I'd like to cover in that meeting, which I haven't done in the past, which is, hey, in that meeting, what I'm going to ask you is the following set of questions, and it's probably easier for you to give me a verbal download than to email me, but here's what I'm going to ask, which is, I'd love to understand what's the context. Why are you looking for some outside help now, and why now? What's changed? When you're looking to get started, what's sort of the ideal profile of the person you're looking for? And I'm going to ask you some specifics around, is this going to be on-site or remote, and so forth, and how you envision the project going and what kind of outcomes you're looking for. So I might start giving that kind of people a preview of what I'm going to ask, so they know I'm not going to waste their time, but not expecting them to give me an answer.
Yeah, exactly. And with clients I work with, the majority of people will not reply to the email. But when you step into the room, the first thing they say is, wow, those questions, that I've been thinking about them since you sent that email. And for the majority of us, the conversation starts before we walk in the room. If all we do is say, hey, let's schedule a Calendly link and let's set up a context meeting, awesome. You're missing a valuable opportunity to save them time. What we want to do is land in their subconscious and get them thinking about it before you walk in the room, because a good listener will listen to what they say. A great listener will change the way they express the idea, and that is all part of the setup. So listening happens before, during, and after the conversation. Let's zoom into the room, though, Will. Let's have that conversation in terms of the context. Here's a critical piece of neuroscience. Let's call it the science of listening versus the art of listening. The three numbers are critical to understand. The speaker and the listener are in a dance in the conversation. They change positions. Sometimes they're the speaker, sometimes they're the listener. You may think of it as a simultaneous equation in maths. And here's the numbers that are really critical, because a good listener will focus on what they say, and a great listener will notice what they haven't said. And when you notice what they haven't said, you will be working on bigger problem sets. You will make more transformational shift for your clients, and your referral rate will go up, because they say, look, Will didn't just listen to what I said. He saw me, he heard me, he valued me, and he helped me express an idea that had been sitting in the back of my mind for quite a long time. So the three numbers, that if you know these three numbers, you'll be very comfortable listening carefully to what they haven't said. So the speaker speaks at about 125 to 150 words per minute. Yet they can think in a range from 900 to 1600 words per minute. I speculate the kind of clients you work with, Will, they're closer to the 1600 words per minute than the 900. That means the first thing they say, it's between 5 and 14% of what they think and what they mean. Why would you gamble your time just in that dialogue with what they're saying the first time? It's like somebody pressing send on an email they just wrote without reviewing it, drafting it, and sending it again. Now, this massive gap between our thinking speed and our speaking speed typically means that we need to be careful about how we are listening. Now, the 400 here is you can listen at up to 400 words per minute. So you're bored, distracted, you're solving, you're anticipating when the speaker is speaking, because they're speaking at 125 words a minute. You can listen at 400 words a minute. So there's a 300 word per minute gap. And that is when you need to start to notice what they're not saying. Now, Will, how conscious are you about noticing what isn't said in a conversation?
I'm not sure how to rate my ability. Tell me about. I mean, I'm probably somewhat aware, but tell me some ways that I could self-assess.
Well, again, think about in that moment while somebody's saying something, are you going, yep, I know the exact consultant they need. They've worked on these projects before. I'm thinking about their availability. If they roll off that project then that'll be good timing. I hope they about 2 months out, because that'll be perfect, right? Is that what typically might be going on in your mind based on what you said originally?
No. My superpower, if I have one, is I don't mind appearing to be an idiot and asking super naive questions. So I'm almost the opposite of what you were suggesting. I'm much more,
So 3 super naive questions sound like.
yeah. So I'd be, so typical questions that I'd be like are, okay, help me understand how you would think about this, this project being done. I mean, different people would approach this project in different ways. Like, what's your mental model of how this would happen, right? So that would be one. Another one would be, okay, let's say that we were at the end of this project. It was complete. It was successful. You got exactly what you needed or exceeded it. What does that look like for you? Like, what either is the deliverable you have in your lap, or what's the change that you've seen in your company? Tell me about that. Describe that world for me. And and then one would be, okay, I think I have the context now. You've walked me through it. What are you thinking about? What would be the ideal skill set of the person? I'd love to have you walk me through that. And then once we kind of go through the ideal industry background, functional background, et cetera, then help me prioritize, and what are the must-haves in your view, and what are the maybe what are the nice-to-haves. So I'm kind of the opposite of that, like knowing the answer. I'm always trying to truly assume that I don't know inside their head and getting them to articulate it, because if they can tell you what they're looking for, it makes it a lot easier to deliver.
I'm curious about the phrase "help me understand." Is that deliberate language? Help me understand.
Yeah, I think so. To the extent that I can, to the extent that I'm mindful of it, I try to avoid yes/no questions.
Yeah.
I'll ask, in some cases, tell me a story about, tell me more about, help me understand would be one of my catchphrases. Hey, walk me through this process end to end as you see it. I like having people articulate that. I don't understand that. Tell me a little bit more about that. Catchphrases. Phrases that are open-ended enough that get people to continue to talk, because, people say one thing and then you ask them to, why is that, or go a little bit deeper, and then go a little bit deeper again, and that's when you really start to hear, what's really on their mind.
Yeah. And do you think the balance of your questions are more about from present to future? What percent of your time do you think you're unpicking the past?
For me, I'll throw this in here. I'm curious to hear your reaction. It doesn't exactly answer your question. Get to it. But in terms of time allocation, I don't maybe unpack the past too much. I will ask usually, what have you done so far? And why do you feel you need to get outside support? All right. Because normally it just makes more sense to do it with your own employees, right? Like, a consultant might assume, of course you should use consultants, but there's usually a reason that companies don't use, are going to external support. So I try to understand that. But one thumb rule I'd maybe just throw in here is the 70-30 squared rule, which is, I'm curious if you think this is about right, or if you've seen some different numbers. 70-30 squared rule is, in a conversation with a client, in this kind of conversation, the discovery call, context discussion, that sort of meeting, the client should be speaking 70% of the time, and we should be speaking 30% of the time, and 70% of the time we're speaking should be questions. So only 30% of 30% should be us kind of stating our point of view or our background, because frankly, our case studies are kind of boring. People like talking about their, they are. It's boring. People like talking about their problems, not hearing about your case studies. So 70-30 squared rule. I have a question for you, actually. So let me turn around. One thing that you didn't talk about yet is, maybe it's part of that phase of listening before the actual meeting, but it's also during the meeting, is mirroring the client's specific vocabulary and language. So they might be referring to their problem using one set of vocabulary, and maybe you normally refer to that something else, but like adopting their language when you speak with them about it. What's your point of view about that?
As an industry, consultants that you've described are very future focused. So one of the parts of mirroring you would typically want to be very cautious about is the obsession with the future. That's like, looking forward, we can do this, and in 12 months' time, all of those things. A lot of client insight in the way they use language is they either stuck in the past, they're very much in the present, or they do talk about the future. So calibrate your language to their time horizon, because if you're asking a set of questions about the future and they are still stuck in a problem set or a project failure from 2-3 years ago that they fully haven't understood why that project failed in the context of their system, their organization, you may be painting a future vision that's far too distant for them to be able to go, I can credibly believe that's happening. So when you think about a vocabulary matching, think about the time way you are expressing an idea. Be careful. Sometimes you may be a little too far ahead of the client. So calibrate, dial in to where they're using language around time as an example. The other heuristic to use, and you can pick this up really quickly, are they speaking in stories or statistics? Are they big picture or are they sequential and linear? You need to be matching at that abstraction as well, not just the pace at which they speak or the slowness at which they speak or the extent to which they may pause. So you need to become conscious when you're listening. You need to listen not just to what is being said, the content. You need to listen to how they're expressing the idea. Earlier on, Will, you mentioned mental models, and there are some code words that can point to the mental models if you listen carefully. They fit into the word set called absolutes. When they say words like always, never, exactly, precisely, these are some code words that you go, this is the edge of their mental model. I was working with a client in professional services, and they were running the business development end of the organization. They had 60 staff, and they were so frustrated with their public sector division. And my client said, public sector, they're always slow in procurement. They never grow. It's a waste of time. We should shut down the division and sell it to somebody else. And all I reflected back to her in that moment was, always? And then she smiled back at me and she said, well, not always, but mostly. I said, okay, who's the exception to the rule? And she said, well, there's 3 customers in public sector that do grow. I said, okay. I said, what do they have in common? And she said 3 characteristics: that they were commercially orientated, they had a performance culture, and the third thing was about their measurement systems. I said, sounds like they should be in the commercial division. She goes, oh my God, that's something we haven't even thought about. And in that moment, because she used the word always, I knew I'd touched the edge of her mental model. And my job wasn't to say, oh, you're wrong. It's like, what situations is always? Because there's no absolutes when we're dealing with humans and professional services. There's always exceptions. And in that moment, for me, matching her language precisely, but not interpreting and just simply saying the absolute back to her, a richer discussion emerged. Now, wind the clock forward 12 months later, when their new planning cycle came about, they moved those 3 clients, and 2 years later, they got much more growth out of them because they treated them like commercial clients rather than public sector clients. So that's where you need the language matching, Will.
I love the fact that you shared that story. What it sounds to me like the lesson from that is there are certain code words you should be aware of and listening to, and not necessarily challenge them, but you should come up short and maybe query certain code words. Tell me if there's sort of other, expand on that a little bit.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, the client can see as their current context. Your role as the advisor is to create perspectives they haven't considered in the moment. So I was working with a pharmaceutical organization, and it was a room full of very qualified chemistry experts, PhDs in chemistry, masters in chemistry, mechanical and electrical engineers. They were running a very complex manufacturing site, but impurities were emerging in the production line, which meant batches were needing to be thrown out, and batches were $3 million, $4 million, $5 million. They weren't passing QA, but this was happening infrequently. And the CEO brought me in, and there's 93 people in a room. These are all the leaders around this production site. And we had the setup, and they said, okay, Oscar's going to run the next part of this session. And I simply asked the group to turn to each other and tell them who they were not listening to on the production line. And what we're doing there is creating a very external perspective for them. It's also a way of double clicking on what's not being heard in the system. So I said, who are we not listening to? And eventually we did a roll up in the room, and it was very clear we weren't talking to frontline production people. And I was there for a whole day on the workshop. I said, great, your job now is to get out of this room and go and talk to those production people. They went and talked to the production people. There was something on a daily control board, which is their way of managing quality, from a year and a half ago, where a frontline worker had said a pipe needs replacing on the production line, and they didn't want to stop the production line. They were running at full capacity, and it was a $60 pipe to fix it up and put it in. Everyone came back in the room. They said, oh, it's the pipe. The pipe. A $60 pipe was causing millions of dollars of wasted production. In that moment, the questions you want to be asking are creating perspectives that they're not common to. So an example might be, I'm curious what the regulator in your industry might say if they were listening to our conversation. If we had the competitor listening to our conversation right now, what would they be laughing about? Because we haven't discussed. And all of a sudden, you move their focus away from the project to the bigger systemic context. And that connects you with bigger, more transformational work as a consultant. So create questions and perspectives that draw them out, not necessarily into the distant future, because some people mightn't be able to process that, but just beyond their current context.
I love that idea of asking who we are not listening to, and and those other ones too. Great. What would the regulators say? What would your competitors think? Beautiful.
If imagine you're in a 1 hour meeting, or not, you could be in a half an hour meeting, roughly 70% of the way through the meeting. This is a question that all my clients go, wow, Oscar, when I use this question, it helps me understand what they have heard, not just the questions I've asked. So I'll give you a couple of variations of this. If you're following the 70-70 squared approach, pose it as a question. If not, you can ask a simple question. The simple question might be, Will, how would you summarize the last 30 minutes to your manager. And all of a sudden, you'll hear what they heard, not what you said. And you'll hear, more importantly, what they haven't heard in what you've said. Now, the other way I ask this question is, hey, Will, I'm curious. We've got a few minutes before we draw to a close. If your CEO was in the room right now, what's the question they always ask that we haven't covered off? And they always step back and go, oh, that's a really good question. You know what? Actually, there's a code word for you, by the way. That's actually is a code word that they're rethinking their approach. They'll say, actually, she always says XYZ, and we haven't covered it off. Can we spend our remaining time on that? Sure, of course, because you know the person in front of you has to eventually go to someone in authority. Or you could ask that same question about the CFO or the head of engineering or head of customer contact, anything in your system. These take them out of the context of the conversation we've had and draws them into the bigger system in which we need to operate. And in doing so, we can hear what's not said.
I want to react to that with just an idea that occurred to me, part of that sort of 96% or something in my brain while you were talking, which is, it's just an idea. I'm sorry, it's not a question for you, but when, sometimes members of the show, consultants, any professional will be doing more of a catch-up call with someone, right? And where you might be hoping to plant the seed that even if they don't have a project, that you're hoping that they would mention you to someone else. So I love your thing about what would you say to your manager. A variation of that would be, hey, if you were talking with someone a month from now and we're going to describe to them my practice, how would you articulate what I do? So the
way to flip that, because that's all about you.
Yeah, well, true.
Yeah, so just flip it slightly and go describe the problem that we solved.
Sure. That's if it's like you've served a client, but I was thinking more like, hey, if you were just chatting with someone that you know, right, like a professional contact, catching up with them.
Yeah.
And so like you haven't served them as a client, and they're like, yeah, sure, I'll make sure I mention you if someone comes along, and then you say, oh, well, how would you articulate what I do?
Beautiful.
And then
yeah,
like perfect. To make sure that they are explaining what you do in the way that you hope that they would, or maybe they totally, misinterpret it, or, to your point about what is not said, you hear kind of their version of it. I want to turn to part 3. So of the discussion, you mentioned about the before, the during, and the listening after. Let's turn back to that context discussion. So tell me about listening after.
So think carefully about, number one, note-taking during the meeting. Make sure you are clear about how and when you're taking notes and the purpose of note-taking. And for some clients, they're actually happy to have the conversation recorded, but this plays into after the meeting. If you think you can't listen after the meeting, take an action during the meeting and don't deliver on it, and the client will think you never listen. So be careful to confirm in the moment during the discussion when you take an action, what action you're taking, and say it out aloud. Just to confirm, the action I'm going to take is, because you want to make sure they hear what you said. So if there's an adjustment or a correction, we can make it in the moment. So the setup for after the meeting is really crucial. After the meeting, you will generate a set of artifacts, and they may be what happened in the conversation. This may be supplemental materials. It may be case studies that you kind of giggled about earlier on, how boring they were, Will. But make sure that after the meeting, within 24 hours, again, pose a question back. And the way we've worked with our clients of this is and it depends on the level of the relationship. And I'll give you a few variants on this. Typically, when you have 24 hours to sleep on it, there are some other things that pop up for you. How anything pop up since our conversation yesterday? Most clients get not much. About a third of our clients get some additional insight. Now, one of my clients phrases it this way. Typically, you need 24 hours, but more importantly, when you're in the shower, an idea pops to mind about what we didn't cover off. What was it? Now, they're in the creative industry, so they can use that kind of language in professional services. And it's a common metaphor for idea generation in that industry. So be careful with that one. Finally, just the act of you asking them, have you thought anything more about it, will give you another opportunity to hear some things that may not have popped up. Or more importantly, if they're doing a beauty parade, something may pop up that another provider has asked, but you didn't ask. So that gives you an opportunity to answer that question as well. So when it comes to after the meeting, it's a given that you're going to do your actions. It's a given you're going to send artifacts. It's a given you're going to send case studies. Yet the most important thing you can ask them is there anything else that's come up that we didn't discuss, given you've had some time to sleep on it?
Mm-hmm. One simple thing is also to, and this is maybe even a pre-artifact, is sending a recap email afterwards. I try to do this. I'm not always the best at it, but I try. Where it's just like, hey, just wanted to recap our discussion, and this is kind of showing that you were listening, right? Like, here's the points we covered. Here's what I agreed to do, and here's what you said that you were going to do, right? You said you would like send me the last strategy document you had from 2 years ago or whatever, and I'm going to put together a proposal, and here's the key points as I understand it. So you mentioned that here's the situation, here's what you're working on, here's what you're hoping to accomplish. Did I capture that correctly? Right. What's your reaction to something like that? Not a day later, but just within the next hour after the call.
Yeah, sorry. I would just assume that's table stakes, that everybody who's selling time is going to be doing this. Here's the bonus point for that one. If you have been noticing their communication preference, you may record that as a voice memo, you may record that as a video, you may not send that as an email.
I would not.
So if you've been listening carefully enough, you could literally record that in the car or at the end of the meeting and send it to them straight away. And that is a different level of listening. I was working with a vice president once, and I said to her, what's your communication preference? She goes, I get emails all day, every day, Oscar. Here's my mobile. Just text me. I will reply to a text within an hour, but don't waste my time. And no problem. So all I did was type in a text summary of a meeting I attended and said, I just need you to be aware that we need to make a decision on this. I didn't ask her to make the decision on the text message, but because I asked the question about her communication preference, all of a sudden we have a different level of communication that takes place.
I would not have thought of, and I have not tried the idea of doing a voice memo or a video, right? I guess a selfie video and sending that. I would not have thought of that. Tell me about your experience, or how people have responded to that. How would you even know? Like, do you want me to send you a video of myself? Tell me about that.
But again, this back to the question about communication preference. So you'll notice that people who like visuals probably going to get up on a whiteboard and use a marker pen as an example. So create something that's graphical or visual as an artifact rather than exclusively text-based, because that's our communication preference, or it's the least friction for us. The bonus by creating this artifact that's distinct, different, unique, differentiated, is it increases its shareability. So often they will forward this to other people who weren't present in the meeting and go, oh, have a listen to this or watch this. The reason you do it, of course, is to create a summary. But if you're communicating something that's a complex idea, which most of you listening in your consulting work is, you're trying to simplify the complex. This artifact, if you increase shareability, you will progress the idea faster in the organization as well.
I am having some strong flashbacks right now, Oscar. When I started at McKinsey, which was in 2001, it was right at the tail end of the voicemail era at McKinsey. So, like, the people had just been started to issue cell phones. We didn't have Blackberries yet, and voicemails were, there was no email on phones, right? So voicemails were the preferred method of communicating with the partners. And we actually had training on how to do a voicemail. So as business analysts, we would practice our voicemail, at least I would, 3 or 4 or 5 times until you got it just right. So it was like less than 60 seconds. So you could summarize everything for the partner of where the progress was, and you'd send it off. And it was like pre-email era, almost pre-email. You had email on your desktop. So you're bringing us back to 2001.
Yeah, look, everybody in their hand, in their cell phone, is a movie studio, a radio studio, and the communication modality creates positioning for you as a consultant. If your consultancy is all about difference, then why are you always sending email? Because everybody's doing that. Think about how you communicate as much as what you communicate, and you will occupy a different space in your client's mind about the kind of problems that it is possible to solve together.
Yeah, I love that. We have talked about listening in general, but I'd love to hear a bit about your practice. You've mentioned, you've alluded several times to clients you've served, but tell us about your consulting practice.
Look, my consulting practice is very different from a decade ago when I started it. Today, we have a series of tools for clients to self-assess themselves around their listening prowess or lack of it. And we've had nearly 26,000 of our clients take the assessment. We've also got a well-known jigsaw puzzle exercise that kind of blows people's mind about how a jigsaw puzzle game is like taking a client brief or the context conversation, as we refer to it here. We've got a podcast series where we've interviewed over 100 of the world's most diverse listening professionals, from submarine commanders to sonar operators to dolphin trainers, all the way through to hostage negotiators, journalists, deaf, blind people, and everything in between. We've created a series of practice cards for people to embed their learning afterwards. And as a result, I probably spend about a third of my time authoring. That's either podcasts, books, or speaking from stage. A third is delivering workshops physically and virtually. And the rest of my time is spent reading academic literature about listening to make sure I'm staying up with the latest information around the world. And at the moment, one of the things I'm experimenting with is a number of people who are reaching out to me and go, how do I license your stuff into my programs? My goal is to be the Intel inside of leadership programs, because everybody talks about listening, but nobody explains how to do it. So that's how the practice is structured.
What are 2 or 3 points about listening that you hope listeners take away, or that maybe we didn't cover but we should have? What are the two or three things that everyone should know about listening?
Number one, if all you're doing is listening to what people say, you're missing 80% of the conversation. Great listeners listen to what's not said. Great listeners know how to listen before, during, and after the conversation. And 3 tips to increase your listening productivity before you go into any conversation is manage your notifications, electronic or otherwise, and be careful. A lot of us wear connected watches these days. That's the new distraction. Number 2, make sure you drink a glass of water before you go into a conversation, and drink a glass of water all 30 minutes in a conversation and offer that to your guest. And tip number 3 is be conscious of your breathing, but even more importantly, be conscious of the breathing of the people you're speaking to. If you can prepare to listen and know that the most important person you need to listen to first is yourself, then you'll have a great listening platform.
Now, Oscar, I believe that you have a self-diagnostic quiz for people to test their listening and see what their opportunities are to grow. Tell us about that.
Yeah, please visit listeningquiz.com if you want to learn about the 4 barriers that get in the way when it comes to your listening. You'll get a 5-page report that explains the barriers, and more importantly, 3 tailored tips based on your primary and secondary listening barrier. Practical things that you can do during a conversation.
I love that. We will include that link in the show notes so you can click on it, listeners, but that'll be listeningquiz.com. Oscar, this was a fantastic conversation. I enjoyed so much hearing your tips, and some of these are gold. I'm going to have to listen to the show again because I don't think I captured all of them, but I love the thing about who are we not listening to, really flips it. So many great tips. Oscar, thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks for listening, Will.